Hi everyone, and welcome back to the neighborhood. Today, we're taking a look at the HIFIMAN Ananda. I've already checked out the Aria previously on the channel, and the Ananda is that headphone's little brother, coming in at a much cheaper price of only $6.99. So let's get into it. The build of the Ananda is very similar to a variety of other HIFIMAN headphones. In fact, it's kind of a Frankenstein between the rest of the lineup. Essentially, the Ananda has the same headband and strap of the HE5SE and Sundara, with the cups and pads being more similar to those found on the Aria, Edition X, Edition XX, and those of the like. Like the Edition XX and not the Aria, however, the cups of the Ananda, although they appear to be made out of metal, it seems like they're actually made out of a dense plastic cup material or grill to my judgment. At the $700 price point, I'd want more metal to be used in the build here, but they seem durable enough still. And while the cups don't swivel, it is less of an issue on the Ananda than the Sundara for me due to the Ananda's large asymmetrical cups. In terms of the pads, they are similar to the Aria in that they have a perforated leather-like material on the inside, a cloth-like woven material on the portion that touches your face, and a non-perforated leather-like material on the outside. But I use the word leather-like because unlike the Aria, these pads don't feel as supple or sheepskin-like to my touch compared to the more expensive set. Nevertheless, the head strap does appear to be leather, and it distributes weight well across the top of my head. And the Ananda as a whole has plenty of room in its ear cups and generally fits really comfortably overall. But what about the cable? Well, the cable is atrocious. It's reminiscent of medical tubing, and there are creases left in it from where it has been bent on occasion. This set came from the Honest Audiophile, and I know from his video of these headphones that the cable came that way out of the box. So needless to say, the cable did not play well, and I'm unsure why HIFIMAN didn't include one of their newer fabric cables such as those that come with the Sundara and other models in the box here. So what is the Ananda sound-wise? Well, the sound of the Ananda is pleasing and inoffensive and relatively close to the midline throughout the frequency response range. Having said that, these are not bass cannons, nor bass specialists. Instead, the bass of the Ananda is relatively integrative and assistive, and mild to moderate in its macrodynamics. These do roll off relatively significantly into the sub-bass, and there is not a lot of slam or punch for a planar dynamic. Bass detailing is sufficient given the price range, however, as there is a decent amount of bass information present, even if you may have to strain your ears at times to hear it. The mid-range is shallow, scooped, and therefore lacks some presence here or there, depending on the track. As such, the Ananda is not a vocal master. Vocals are well-centered and have a good amount of detail and clarity to them, but they are decidedly half a step back in the mix, and lack some audiophile forwardness to their character on occasion, even if they are forward enough to remain distinct most of the time. Interestingly, female vocals seem just as victimized as male ones, as distinct scoops in the mid-range occur in both genders' vocal ranges. Still, each scoop is not really that cavernous, so while I found myself personally lusting for the Ananda's vocals to be slightly more energetic, they may be forward enough for most. To my ear, the mid-range leans towards the mildly thinner side of things and lacks some body and vigor on certain tracks, where I would expect the mid-range to be fuller and more forward. So while the mid-range is soft and delicate in its delivery, and therefore pleasant, it also comes across as a touch hollow in comparison to other headphones. The Ananda's treble also follows somewhat of a similar pattern in its presentation, but less so. What I mean by this is that when I first heard the Ananda at CanJam 2019 in Los Angeles, I kept going back and forth between it and the Sundara in comparison, noting each headphone's treble performance as one of the distinguishing factors between the two. At the time, I felt the two headphones sounded remarkably similar, with the Ananda being the more balanced set and the Sundara being the more energetic headphone in general. The first generation of the Sundara simply had a slightly sweeter, more engaging treble with a certain melodious character to its gleam, which the Ananda did not possess. The Ananda's treble, although good in its own right, just lacks some emotional engagement to my ears. Listening to it again all these years later, I still feel the same way about the Ananda, even though I don't feel that way about the stealth revision of the Sundara. So while the treble is well extended and detailed enough, and should be viewed as a strength of the Ananda in its own right, it has a softer delivery and more mellow presentation in comparison to a number of other HIFIMANs. There is some decent air in the upper treble here without going overboard, but I wouldn't mistake the Ananda for being HIFIMAN's airiest offering either. I also wouldn't describe the treble as being as splashy as some of HIFIMAN's other sets. Soundstage here is circular around one's head and technically very good. It is above average even at the price point, thanks in part to its larger asymmetrical cups, I'm sure. But Soundstage is not as large nor as deep as say something like the HIFIMAN Aria version 1, which I reviewed prior. In the Ananda's favor, however, its soundstage is probably somewhat more accurate, less stretched and more realistic and natural sounding in comparison to the Aria version 1, even if it's somewhat more 2D too. Having said that, separation in the Ananda is great, and instruments have both good distinctiveness to them and are well represented in space. Peripheral detailing was a particular strength of the Ananda, and top-notch and faithful in its reproduction. Imaging and tracking within the soundscape was precise and assists the Ananda with its detailing capacity. Detail and resolution are also good for the price point, but it's ultimately not going to keep up with the likes of my Mr. Speaker's Ether CX or my Meze Empyrean when these are powered off the right sources. But the Ananda is decidedly a step up from the 4XX, Deva, and even the Sundara in this regard, off most sourcing that is. However, there is some slight over-smoothing and mild compression affecting the overall resolution of the Ananda to some extent. Speaking of sourcing, a feather in the Ananda's hat is that it sounds excellent off most sourcing, and is not very amplifier picky. While it does scale somewhat with higher end amplification, such as my Gold Note DS10 Plus, it arguably isn't that influenced, and the reverse is also true in that it sounded consistently hi-fi off the majority of other sources I was able to test as well. Sources that I thought paired particularly well with the Ananda were the balanced 4.4mm headphone output of the Matrix Audio Mini iPro 3 DAC and the Bravo Audio Ocean. I think the iPro 3 worked well in that its Saber chip's mid-hump compensated for the slight mid-dips of the Ananda quite well. The Bravo Ocean also provided more than sufficient current to the Ananda, and the Ananda seemed to lap it up without any difficulties. I actually liked this pairing with a bunch of different tubes, although swapping tubes did alter the Ananda's presentation slightly. My two favorite were the Raytheon tube and the CEI tube, the former of which was wider in its staging and more musical in its expression, while the later was somewhat cooler, more exacting, and additionally intimate in comparison. Timbre was generally leaning slightly cool and mildly dry, but mostly neutral in its presentation off most sources. Although the title of HIFIMAN Timbre Champ belongs to the Deva in my book at this time, the Ananda is a close second in comparison to most of their other offerings that I have heard to date. Still, I also have the Aria Stealth in for ongoing review and evaluation at this time, and I'm not going to say too much about that headphone here other than to say that it also has some pretty excellent timbre, perhaps the best amongst all other HIFIMANs. So the Ananda has a number of considerable strengths even if it's not a perfect headphone. At a price of $699, I think that the Ananda is somewhat overpriced given its build, sound, and what else is out there in the audiophile marketplace at this time. I'd like to see HIFIMAN lower the price of these by at least $100 or even more, especially given that the Edition XS is getting popular praise from other reviewers. I hope to review that unit soon when HIFIMAN sends it to me. Having said that, the Ananda is an inoffensive, smooth, and capable headphone, and if I were buying only one open-back planar without consideration of source, even at its price, this could be it. But while the Ananda objectively performs as an 8 out of 10 or better in most categories, its biggest strength may ultimately also be its biggest weakness, as its consistency and jack-of-all-trades approach may be perceived by some as a dearth in character or absence of a particular charm. But before I go, I wanted to remind you guys to make sure to subscribe here on YouTube if you haven't done so already. Also consider liking this video and leaving a comment to help with the YouTube algorithm. You can also consider following the channel at all its other access locations, including YouTube, www.intoitreviews.com, the Twitter, Instagram, or become a member of the Patreon. The Patreon is only $1.50 a month, and it gets you access to early written reviews like this one. And with that, I'm out for now.